Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I see all of you are coming in as attendees. We appreciate you being here. It's 3 o'clock. It's time to start. So I want to give you a few guidelines before we start. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A in the bottom of your screen and not the chat. Our panelists will be looking at the Q&A and not the chat, so please let them know if you have any questions, and if there's a particular panelist you would like to have answer your question, just indicate that in the Q&A. I also want to encourage you now, and you'll be encouraged later, to become a member of the Evergreen. It's a wonderful place. They have beautiful events, and I can tell you firsthand that seeing the place decorated in the winter for the holidays is just spectacular. So strongly encourage you to join. And with that, we are so pleased to welcome our panelists to the first part of our 3-part series, Exteriors at Evergreen. If you haven't already done so, please sign up for the other 2. If you aren't able to make them, all of these will be recorded and shared with you, and we'll be able to give you access to them. So with that, I will turn it over to Lori. Thank you for being here, and enjoy the panel.
All right, Jamie, thank you so much for welcoming everyone and for that introduction. My name is Lori Finkelstein. I am the Philip Franklin Wagley Director and Curator of the Evergreen Museum and Library, Johns Hopkins University. Coming to you live from my basement in Baltimore City. And I'm joined today by Dr. April Ottinger. We've only been talking to you every day for the past 2 weeks. It's great that I can't say your name. Who is Professor of Art History and Chair of the Visual and Material Culture Program at Goucher, where she is also Director of the Swerin Wogan Institute for the Study of the Book. And so April and I got to know each other probably about 8 months ago when our universities were both still open, because she came to Evergreen to do a little bit of research on our gardens for a course that she was teaching. And we really enjoyed talking about the gardens. And then this quarantine happened, and I started thinking about new ways to engage our visitors. And my original thought was to do a walking tour outside of the Evergreen campus. And I had it in my head that it would be really effective to take my phone and just have all of you, all 112 of you, as my screen is showing me, thank you all for joining us, virtually just walk down the streets with me of Baltimore while I videotaped Evergreen and just chatted about the gardens. And then I realized, this is probably not the best approach, in part because I'm really not an expert on the history of landscape or gardens. And I thought, but I know someone who is, and that was April. So she and I got in touch and began to speak about the wonderful history of the grounds at Evergreen and how we could perhaps flesh out a bigger conversation about them and engage audiences virtually in understanding our grounds. And that's because our grounds aren't really very much a part of our tour at Evergreen. And that's something we're hoping to change, not just virtually today, but in real life, in real actual experiences going forward. So that's a little bit about who we are. I will mention that April's research traces the relationship of humans and nature in the early modern era, and she is the co-author of the 2019 publication, Green Worlds in Early Modern Italy, Art and the Verdant Earth. So we are really thrilled to have her join us here today and provide a historical context for the gardens at Evergreen. And what we're going to lay out for you today is I'm going to provide a brief discussion of Evergreen and its gardens, and then we're going to turn things over to April, who will speak with us much more about the context for why the gardens at Evergreen look the way they do. But before we do any of that, we're actually interested in learning a little bit about you. So, and that'll help us, I think, guide this conversation and make sure that we are, we're appealing to the right audience, because we can't see you. And if you were all sitting with us in Evergreen, I would have a sense of who you are. But it's difficult to do that on Zoom. So we're going to use the poll function And we'd like it if you could all briefly participate with us and answer the questions that we have for you. Have you ever visited Evergreen Museum and Library? Are you a museum member? And are you a docent? Okay. I think everyone has responded, and I think you can all see the poll screen. And so it's showing that a majority of you are familiar with Evergreen. And that is terrific. It'll help us provide a good context for learning more about Evergreen from an outside landscape perspective. For those of you who have never visited Evergreen, we hope that when we reopen, you will join us. We see that several of you are members, but not all. So we hope you'll consider becoming a member. It's an awesome way to support the museum and all the programming that we offer, both virtual programming such as this, but also in person. You can't see the poll screen. Okay, I'm going to read the poll results. Thank you for letting me know that. So the poll results are telling me that 72% of you have visited Evergreen, 22% of you are members, and 12% of you are docents. So almost 3/4 of our attendees are familiar with the museum. And some of you aren't. We hope you'll join us in the future. Okay. So that's very helpful, and thank you for participating in that. I'm going to give a brief Evergreen Museum overview and library. And for those of you who are already familiar with the museum, you probably know that we focus on the Garrett family, who lived in the building between 1878 and 1952. 2 generations of Baltimore's wealthy Garrett family inhabited Evergreen. And it is really largely that family that made the architectural changes to the house and who did the landscape design. So we'll be focusing on both those generations of the Garretts today, but it's important to keep in note that the house was actually built 20 years before they came to live in it. And April's going to go into some details about that and how the landscape design figured into that early history. The house was originally built between 1857 and 1858 for the Broadbent family, and it was originally called Glen Mary. And Evergreen was one of several estates that were constructed in Baltimore, in the northern part of the city, in what at that time period was the county. And it was one of many estates that was in that area, and they dotted the landscape between essentially Charles Street and York Road. And so the Garrett family moves in 1878. And in the early 1880s, they start extensive garden expansion and redesign. And this was by the first generation of Garretts to live there, T. Harrison Garrett and his wife, Alice Whitridge Garrett. And I will tell you a little bit more about her in particular in a couple of minutes. The second generation of the family, John Work Garrett and his wife, also Alice Garrett, did a lot of modernization to the grounds at Evergreen. And John Work Garrett was the son of T. Harrison Garrett and Alice Whitridge Garrett. So I think next slide would be awesome. Okay. Thank you. So as I mentioned before, typically we take guests on actual tours of the interior of Evergreen. But since we can't go inside, we're going to virtually explore the exterior of Evergreen today. The picture that you see on your screen now is what the rear of Evergreen looks like today. So you can see that there are many, it's almost like a layer cake on its side. And there's many pieces that were added on to the back of the house over time. And I'm going to be speaking quite a bit about those next week. So if you care to join me again next Tuesday, I will be here, same time, same station, and I'll be talking about these architectural changes that you see at the back of the house. But today we're going to start with the grounds, as I discussed, really coming out of this interest of wanting to explore the outside at a time when we can't go inside the building. So April, I'd love the next slide.
Okay, here we are.
So one of the things to keep in mind, and this is definitely something that April could go into much more detail about, is this concept of constructing nature at Evergreen, and certainly not unique to Evergreen at all, but very much this early modern and also 19th century concept of building a landscape, right? We tend to describe the outside of our homes where there are trees and flowers as nature, and they are nature, but they're a heavily constructed nature. And that is definitely something that applies to Evergreen. You can see two images on your screen. One is of Evergreen in 1866, so before the Garrett family lives there. And it shows at the front of the photo where the horse and carriage are Charles Street, and towards the rear is York Road. So again, Evergreen is located right now in the northernmost part of Baltimore City, and it was originally part of the county at this time period. And you can see, this is, at the time, it was referred to as a suburban landscape. For our purposes, it was really quite rural. And there were many very rural features on the Evergreen estate early on. If you look at the photo on the right side of your screen from 1887, so about 20 years later, you see the front of the house, and you see the evergreens for which the house is named, and you can see how that natural entrance to the house is very constructed to give this sense of a wooded environment, a house that was not urban. It was away from the crowded city. It was meant to convey nature, but it's essentially a built nature. And so just to keep in mind, I just want to lay the framework for that because we will be going into more detail about that in a minute. April, may I have the next slide, please?
Yep.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. So who's responsible originally for a lot of the landscape design at Evergreen? It was not the first owners of the house. The Broadbent family did not do extensive landscaping. That really fell to Alice Whitridge Garrett, who lived at Evergreen between 1878 and her death in 1920. She was a Victorian garden enthusiast. And under her tenure at Evergreen, she built an expanse of greenhouses, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about the next slide in a minute. And she was very much an enthusiast for the acquisition of rare plants. Her husband, T. Harrison Garrett, is known for building the Garrett Library at Evergreen and for building the large collection of objects that are inside the house. And she took that same passion for collecting to the exterior of the house. I will mention that in both the photos you see of her, she is in fact dressed in costume. This was not her everyday dress. It was certainly not her gardening attire. So I thought that was worth mentioning. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that while we may talk about Alice Garrett as being a gardener at Evergreen, she had an extensive staff that made it possible for her to have beautiful grounds. This was work that was done predominantly by men who were employed by her. Many, but not all, lived on the grounds. And so it was not work that she did herself. And I think it's important to recognize the labor that made the extensive gardens at Evergreen possible. Among those laborers was a head gardener named Charles Uffler, and he actually won many awards for Evergreen. In 1905, in particular, he won awards for both his tomatoes and his flowers at a Baltimore gardening exhibit, and he was quite well known for his work. Okay. April, may I have the next slide?
Yes.
Thank you. So really quickly, I'm going to compare two more slides for you, and then we're going to turn things over to April in a couple of minutes. I just want to draw your attention to the slide on your left, which shows the Evergreen greenhouses. It's a winter shot, which I was thinking it would be really hot today, and you might enjoy seeing some snow. So in total, 7 greenhouses were built under Alice Garrett's tenure at Evergreen between 1882 and 1885. The largest of these, and the first one to be built, was 150 feet long and 25 feet wide, and it had individual rooms for palms, orchids, and ferns. And over the next 3 years, additional greenhouses were added, so that by the late 1880s, there was a pretty expansive collection of greenhouses at Evergreen. According to the Baltimore Sun, there was 20,000 feet of glass at Evergreen, and that's what these greenhouses were constructed of. April, can we just have the next and last slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. So just really quickly to help orient you a little bit to the outdoor campus at Evergreen, this is a schematic, a map showing the garden plan in 1920, which is how it looked when Alice Garrett died. And then again in 1935. We're going to return to this map a few times during the course of this lecture. I just want to show it here once quickly, because if you look at the top portion, you can see extensive structures on the campus. There were the 7 greenhouses, there was a tea house, there was other exterior buildings that dotted what was really a heavily constructed exterior landscape. And by 1935, under the second generation of Garretts to live at the house, a lot of those structures get torn down, and you have a much more streamlined, less heavily constructed landscape. For those of you who are not particularly familiar with the house, the darkened structure where you see number 1 and number 3, that's the house. And so all those numbers and letters you see to the rear of it, that is the gardens off the back. And again, if you join me next week, I will be talking more about the house. But today we really wanted to take you on the journey out the back windows of the house and into the gardens and help you understand the design influences and design choices that the Garretts made during their time at Evergreen. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to my colleague. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lori. And before I begin, I also wanted to say welcome. And I'm imagining 121 folks out there, both near and far. And I'm really glad that you could join us today. And I also wanted to say a special hello and greetings to folks out there in the community. I'm really glad you could join us. And it's been really fun to collaborate on this virtual excursion through the green worlds of Evergreen. And what I would like to talk about with you is really the constellation of ideas that conditioned Evergreen. And I have just a few of the broader ideas that I'd like to think about for the next few minutes with you with regard to the Evergreen. First of all, my area of expertise is early modern visual culture, particularly in Europe and specifically in Venice. And I've always been really intrigued with the ethos of villa culture and also in general the culture of green, because we can't forget that this house is called Evergreen. So we'll come to that, think about that a bit. Picturesque gardening, that is the tradition of early 18th century gardening based in looking back on earlier traditions, 17th century and really even earlier to the ancient Roman tradition of gardens and villas. And then finally, a bit about print culture and what I'll call armchair gardens in the 19th century and genteel landscapes, the gardens of gentle women and print culture for a popular audience. So when we think of Evergreen, those of you who are garden enthusiasts might first think immediately of Andrew Jackson Downing, whose treatise on the theory and practice of landscape gardening was one of the go-to groundbreaking, no pun intended, books on the subject. And Andrew Jackson Downing, of course, was looking back to earlier traditions. He also, by the way, was the editor of the Horticulturalists, one of many popular magazines, publications, widely read. And then Frederick Law Olmsted whose bicentennial of his birth is coming up very soon in 2022. And those of you may be familiar with Olmsted through Central Park. He was the co-designer, but I should mention that in 1883, he did come to Evergreen to consult with Mrs. Garrett at the steep price of $50 and to give her some advice on the layout of her garden. But of course, his projects and his many commentaries in newspapers and such are best known. So big projects like Central Park and the Great White City, Columbian Exposition. So these are the folks you might think of first and foremost, but I wanted to delve a little bit deeper by looking further back at what ideas shaped these two. And so the first concept that I wanted to discuss is the notion of Evergreen as a suburban villa. And I just want to read an excerpt from a quotation that describes the sale of Montrose in 1865. Now, this was an estate, not the Evergreen, but in the same vicinity of the Evergreen. So you can imagine very comparable situation to the one described here. For Evergreen, and in this case, Montrose, the situation is one of the most healthy and attractive in the vicinity of Baltimore. So I'd like to come back to these two very packed ideas of health and aesthetic attractiveness, health and aesthetics. Evergreen was a suburban villa, and those of you who know Baltimore well are aware that this street that I'm pointing to here, Northern Avenue, was the northernmost boundary of the city. So what we had beyond that was really the country. So literally sub orbis is outside of the city walls is the area where estates like Montrose and also the Evergreen estate were located. And in fact, right here, I'm pointing to you more or less the lands, which were very much kind of a rural landscape outside of the city in this map from between 1910 and a second edition, 1913. These are the trolley lines, by the way. And again, those of you who know Baltimore know that this is Towson. And this is the trolley that ran roughly along the course of York Road. But here we have, this is Evergreen, where Evergreen was. Really, it was truly outside of the city walls at the time that it was developed and built. So this brings me to the general concept of suburban villas. And the subject of the villa is a vast topic that has as much to do with an ethos, an idea, a state of mind, as it does with a physical place. And I just bracket this very vast idea with two quotations here. One taken really early, Pliny the Younger. Here you thought we were talking about 19th and 20th century. I'm taking you now back to the 1st century CE with Pliny the Younger, whose letters describing his various villas are famous sources for understanding just what was meant by the villa as a place and the villa as a kind of a state of mind, and also just the location, the ideal location of a villa. And by the way, Pliny the Younger is the nephew to Pliny the Elder, who perished in the gases of Vesuvius and who wrote the Natural History. So Pliny the Younger's love of nature was certainly very much near and dear to the heart of his family. But in this little excerpt here, I just wanted to call attention to the words I have highlighted in red, that he describes the areas around his villa as though they were a painting or a drawing, an imaginary landscape. So we're not talking about raw land or raw nature. We're talking about nature that has been aestheticized or somehow framed into an image in the mind's eye. And then he goes on to describe where the villa should be located. In the case of this particular villa he's describing, he says, although it's at the foot of the hill, it commands a good view, as if it were on a kind of a rise in the land. And so you can look out from the villa across the land and have a wide view by implication. Now jumping down to Charles Platt, who we'll come back to. He was an authority on the Italianate garden in America, and he goes on to talk about the villa in the Italian sense, he says, and he says, all formal parts of the grounds are arranged in relation to the house, and the house is a part of the grounds. That is, the house is, in a sense, part of the grounds an extension of the house. And so these are all ideas that are rolled into a deep tradition that has to do with the siting of the villa, ideally on a hill, fresh air, the healthy quality. The fresh air is salubrious. It's good for the health to breathe fresh air, to be outside of the city. And it's also an aesthetic quality. It's like a picture, these landscapes. And we can learn more by tracing this, and that's our little short cultural excursion through the villa. For example, the medieval writer Piero de Crescenzi, whose treatise on gardens, which was dedicated to a Bolognese prince, was a bestseller both in the Middle Ages and in Renaissance print cultures when many editions of this were printed. And I just wanted to put this out to you. This is a lovely manuscript version from the Morgan, with a beautiful image of Crescenzi, the author, who is in a kind of blue-black robe of a scholar who is taking the prince into the confines of the garden and is going to talk about the collection of different kinds of plants and herbs, trees, shrubs that are in the garden. So essentially the garden is a collection. And that this is also the enterprise of sophisticated people is one of the key themes in the garden treatise. That gardening, or the ars hortilorum, the art of gardening, is a liberal art in and of itself. It's that, and again, it's not that the prince is down there digging around as the rest of us do in the garden, but the prince is one who is looking and surveying the collection, that this is an intellectual enterprise and befitting of an educated person, and ideal for as an activity for solitary contemplation. So in other words, villas and gardens are good for the mind as much as the body. And I should add that, you know, many of the herbs grown in this garden are medicine too, essentially, herbal medicine. Another glimpse into the history of the garden, this kind of a series of portraits of gardens seen from a bird's eye view. These are, this is one of the Medici gardens of the famous Medici family of Florence, who also had a whole constellation of suburban villas. And you can see here this notion of the extension of the house really is the garden, that this is all in one, the house and garden are one. And by the way, this Italianate garden with its sort of gridded structure and organization is going to also feature later in the Evergreen. So now, back to this notion of green. So we've talked about in general villa cultures, villa culture, good for the mind, good for the body. But I'd like to talk even more specifically about green things. So green tinted glasses, the color green, evergreen, itself has a deep history in writing and in images, in word and image. As early as, say, the 7th century, we read that green foments the sight. That's Isidore of Seville. Or Marsilio Ficino, a Renaissance writer, says basically the same thing, that green makes one feel young again. And even Samuel Pepys speaks of this in his letters about using green spectacles or green glasses. So maybe we all need to go to Amazon and find our green glasses. It's good for the soul to see things in green. It was supposedly good for the eyes. But again, culturally, there is something about green. So I just wanted to sort of emphasize that in the name, even the name evergreen has this overriding connotation. And just a footnote, fun summer reading. I bet no one was expecting this. Jane Fonda in her green dress, smoking a cigarette. I'm not sure that's so green, but this is the cover of a fun book that I'll just give my little book recommendation that if you like, we'd like to delve more into the history of green. This is just a very fun book. And I thought it was kind of prescient, this cover from 2014, because, you know, now she wears a red jacket to protest, call attention to climate change. So that can be your if you can't find your green glasses, you can read about the color green in this wonderful book by Michel Pastoureau. All right, but back to the evergreen and the cultural dimensions of the evergreen. I'd like to turn to the subject of the picturesque. And the picturesque is a vast topic that we could trace again back to the classical tradition, but we'll begin with the 17th century and the 18th century, with the paintings of Claude, actually in the 17th century. The painting on your left here is really a textbook example of a painting that Claude Lorrain, the French painter, rendered of a kind of an imaginary landscape, which was later theorized in the next century by William Gilpin and others in his circle as the picturesque. That is a landscape that has a particular kind of beauty which is agreeable in a picture. In other words, the picturesque blurs the framed natural world, that is a landscape, with framed images which are painted images. And the I think central subject for thinking about the picturesque landscape is the frame. And so there's a difference between raw nature and landscape. That is, raw nature is raw nature, but through the eyes and the imagination of the beholder or the painter or the writer, the land becomes a landscape. And one of the instruments for creating framed landscapes, a real tangible instrument, was the Claude glass, a famous little accessory that picturesque tourists, that is young men and women traveling about Europe in the 18th century, would bring with them, not only to the continent, but also to around the British Isles. And this was a mirror that was an oval shaped mirror that they might use to look at the landscape views and find the perfect view. And we'll come back to that oval, but just bear that oval in mind. It's all about framing. So how does this figure into the landscape and landscape architecture of the 18th century? Well, the 18th century sees, particularly in England, the development of landscape gardening, and particularly writers and theorists and designers who work with wealthy patrons to what they called improve their estate, the improvement of the estate. That is the shaping of the lands around a country house so that the lands themselves looked like a picture. In other words, the creation of a picturesque landscape. And one of the most famous of these was Humphrey Repton, who published his ideas of specific improvements to the estate in what were called red books, which were kind of mock-ups that were presented to his wealthy patrons who hired him to improve their estates. In other words, to make the lands around their villas effectively look like painted pictures. And so just to give you a sense of how these books operate, they're actually pop-up books. So what we're looking at is the before, and this is the after. So we've improved the estate, one more time, we've improved the estate by, let's see if it's going to allow me to do it again. Well, we've improved the estate, there we are, by putting in a lake, a kind of Palladian bridge. So so if only it was that easy to do this to our own backyards. Boy, that would be nice. Just by a flip of a page, my estate would improve. But bear that in mind as well, because this is, I think, part of the longer extended history of Evergreen. And I'll just make mention of the fact that this was so widespread in popular culture, sort of maybe well-heeled, sophisticated, upwardly mobile culture in the 18th century, that it was popular when it was satirized. And so this is one of my favorite 18th century books of all time, The Tour of Dr. Syntax in Search of the Picturesque. This is the frontispiece of the book. You see a P-I-C, picturesque. It's a poem. And Dr. Syntax, the protagonist who goes in search of the picturesque landscape, he's kind of a quack and goes about and has all sorts of adventures and misadventures to the point that he gets chased by the wildlife off of the estate. And it's an incredibly funny book. But my point is that you can't make fun of it unless it's really widespread. It relies on a large audience sort of understanding this broad taste for the picturesque and then kind of turning it on its head in the 18th century. So that's another fun read. And of course, this also enters into wider culture through reproductive prints and etchings, such as this one here. This is late 17th century etching, but it's kind of a Claudian picturesque landscape, and you'll notice that it's framed just in the way that a Claude glass would frame your picture. It's a nice oval frame. So really, these ideas, I cannot emphasize enough how important they were in shaping ideas of the picturesque in America, Andrew Jackson Downing and Olmsted. So let's turn to the Evergreen now. And so I just was very pleased to see that a number of the colorized photographs from the time of the first Mrs. Garrett happened to be in kind of oval frames, and it reminded me very much of the Claude glass. But the Evergreen, I'd like to turn to that. Phase one of the Evergreen. The Evergreen gardens by design are eclectic. They are a playful, wonderful mixture of English garden traditions, East Asian garden traditions, and you'll note Mrs. Garrett in her kimono was, again, this is an ingredient that flavors the garden. And also the Italianate tradition. So it's really a kind of wonderful synthesis or mishmash of all these wonderful garden traditions. And so I think these two pictures just capture it. The one on the left reminds me a bit of maybe, an English or French garden Giverny with these kind of Adirondack style railings over the bridge. And then on the right-hand side, we'll come back to this idea of the Italianate garden of the Evergreen. But again, I just wanted to read to you an excerpt from the Baltimore Sun, 1904, where describing these gardens as including the Evergreen and other estates on Charles Street north of the city, the author Emily Emerson Lance writes, "The city residences continue in uninterrupted elegance to the northernmost boundary line of Baltimore, and there suddenly melt away into the soft green of a country road bordered with picturesque dells through which ripples a wayside brook." So 1905, the picturesque still fills the imagination of this author. And I think it was also interesting just to situate this particular description in the context of the Great Fire of Baltimore, which had occurred 1 year earlier, 1904. So I thought that was interesting to situate that historically, and in the same year, 1904, again, the year before this description of the picturesque villas of the north of the city. This is when Frederick Law Olmsted, or the junior, not the senior, but the firm, delivered their report on the development of the public grounds for Greater Baltimore, which were to include a kind of emerald necklace, not called that, but emerald necklace, much like the one in Boston, or having lived in Hartford for some time, there's a similar necklace in Hartford, Connecticut, Olmsted's home city. But there was to be one in Baltimore as well. So I just wanted to kind of situate that 1905 description within this context historically. But back to the grounds themselves. So the house, as Lori will share with you in next week, of course, underwent renovations just as the garden did. And the renovations between house and garden were very much related to one another. And with the garden, you were to view the garden from the windows, that is framed by the windows of the house. From 1885, there was once a conservatory and a sun parlor, as you see on the left, and this framed a sort of a lateral vista, one axis view, which we'll turn to in just a moment, the garden. And so in a sense, these rooms mediate between the house and the garden. And the same is true when the library was built. And again, windows frame a glorious view down a long axis of terraces, a long path that one sees from inside the house, from within. And again, the room is kind of a mediator between the interior and the exterior, and effectively kind of blurs the boundaries between the interior and the exterior, so that the garden becomes an extension of the house. And the map I wanted to show you just one more time. We'll look at the 1920 garden plan, but what I'm talking about is this conservatory here, and the view from the window, which is framed effectively, frames a lovely picturesque landscape down a long, narrow axis of terraced gardens. And here again are some of the, some 30 groundsmen of Evergreen from a photograph of 1916. So the timeline again, we'll look at the first phase and then the second. So Olmsted visits in 1883, Olmsted Senior, that is, and Alice Garrett is in charge of the gardens, working closely with Charles Uffler and others on the design of her gardens. And now she is the one in charge of the improvement of the estate. And this is part of a longer and more fascinating history on genteel, sophisticated women as and their crucial role in working out the estate and its shape in collaboration with the gardener. But from here, I turned the map so that we can kind of see where we're looking. So now we're actually right about here and looking down this long axis of paths. And the building number 5 is one of those 7 greenhouses. And take a little tour here. There we go. So the view down the axis is one that is bordered by boxwoods and conifers. And if we turn to the left, we can see that there was once a Gothic greenhouse, or a greenhouse with a Gothic flair, we'll say. It too is rather eclectic, as Lori will talk about next week. And also a fountain, which has since been removed in 1970, I believe. And the fountain had lilies and goldfish, and set right on axis with the entrance of the glass house. And just to give us a glimpse of what was inside, it was quite extraordinary. And it was a collection of rare plants, orchids and ferns, and a place for conversation as much as a place of collection. It was the activity of the genteel Mrs. Garrett. And if we were to move further along the path, and there I've reoriented the map, now we're looking at another greenhouse, number 8, and another planted bed framed by boxwoods, and the house itself is Jacobean style, Gothic style greenhouse. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that greenhouses were quite the rage, glass houses, and perhaps the most famous of these would be the Crystal Palace. Some time earlier, 1853, from the exhibition of the Industry of All Nations, copied from the great Crystal Palace of Paxton, 1851. but this is kind of the quintessential house. It's nowhere near or I say the Evergreen was nowhere near as what is this, but it was a space for display, for collections, for spectacle and wonder and technology, essentially a World's Fair. And the idea, I think, holds true on the smaller scale in these greenhouses of the Garretts. So here's that greenhouse just one more time. I just wanted to move right along to one last structure sort of along that long axis line, which is that rustic tea house that Lori mentioned, 1885. There it is. And yeah, the tea house itself, you could say, distantly relates to, not in style, but just the idea, to the tea houses of East Asian gardens. I should mention that as a footnote, but this particular tea house is rather rustic, and does not look rather Asian at all, but it's still the same idea, a very intimate gathering place for Mrs. Garrett and her friends, where one is surrounded in this very small little space inside by a cozy fireplace and lovely, I'm sure, prints, I suppose, of Washington and Napoleon. And we'll have to do some more research on who these others were in the greenhouse. And it looks like perhaps even some, I don't know if these are topiaries out the window, but a very intimate gathering space for a conversation that even brings the nature in. Look at these, the wallpaper with the, looks like a espalier or some kind of a pergola, as though we've brought the nature inside now in an artificial way. And there is so much to be made of just the idea of collecting flora and fauna. This is another idea attached to Mrs. Garrett's collecting practices. And again, she consulted with Charles Uffler to sort of collect exotic specimens. And it was as much about sort of aesthetics, collection, conversation, sophistication. And then there is just a whole range of metaphorical underpinnings for every kind of flower. And just to make that point, I wanted to show you one of many, many examples of a floral dictionary, floral gift books. And this one happens to be in Goucher's special collections, where we have these wonderful watercolors of different collections of flowers that are juxtaposed by poems with moral and metaphorical meaning. So in other words, there's a great deal that kind of lies behind that culture of collecting flora and fauna. And last but not least, before we leave the elder Mrs. Garrett, she did also think of her garden as a kind of stage. So it's not only a space for collection and intimate gatherings of her friends, but also a place for doing good works, which in the context of the later years during World War I, the garden could be used as a space for fundraising. So here are ladies presumably playing cards, I believe, in order to raise money for World War I, and perhaps more specifically for I think disabled veterans. Lori can help me with this one later, or some of you can help me, who were living on the grounds, I believe. So maybe someone can explain this a bit better. But I find it fascinating that the garden is kind of a stage. And right now we're under the porte cochere of looking out, again, another framed view, I will note. See this lovely arched frame, another framed view of the garden, which is kind of a backdrop. And Alice Warder Garrett will run through her rather quickly because I see we're running out of time. But just as the house was refashioned and updated, so Alice Warder Garrett updated the house and very much favored an Italianate style. So I kind of think of it as kind of a Tivoli in Baltimore idea. And if you're familiar with Tivoli, Tivoli is lies outside of Rome and is most famously the location of the gardens and the villa of the Emperor Hadrian, as well as the Villa d'Este at Tivoli, which is a 16th century Italian Renaissance villa. And Alice, in consultation with the gardeners, made some adjustments namely a stairway that accentuated the terracing. So you can see that here. And she, under her also, the greenhouses are removed and replaced with these garden walls, which you can see here, number 18 on the map. And the idea for the Italianate garden is also a big subject around the turn of the 20th century, but it was a very popular design for gardens. And I would connect Charles Platt's book on Italian gardens as one of the go-to books in popular culture, print culture, for exemplars, because Platt himself took many photographs in Italy, including the Villa d'Este at Tivoli, which you can see here. And I would add that this particular book we checked is in the library collection in the Evergreen libraries. So someone was reading it. And so another writer on gardens was Edith Wharton. So again, to this theme of the gentlewoman as gardener, Edith Wharton's first travel publication was Italian Villas and Their Gardens, a really exquisite book with illustrations by Maxfield Parrish. But, and if you're interested in more recent study of this, Edith Wharton's Italian Gardens by Vivian Russell is a book I would recommend. But Edith Wharton was in the circle of the Garretts, because the Garretts, as many of you know, were in Italy. He, the ambassador, American ambassador to Italy. And so they did move in the same circles and apparently met one another in Paris. And Edith Wharton's writings on estates were influential for Mrs. Garrett. And certainly for the gardens, just to compare with you, the sunken garden at Evergreen on the left to two photographs by Charles Platt. By the way, I have these from Columbia University, has made all of these public on their website, and it's really fun to look through Charles Platt's photographs. But you can see the cypresses and their correspondence with the arborvitae, I think these are, on the Evergreen lands. And I'll conclude here by just making mention of the famous famous theater in Evergreen, which Alice collaborated on with Leon Bakst. And it may seem an odd thing to move from the outside to the inside, except that I would suggest that even, you know, the Bakst theater with its kind of bucolic country scene landscape as the backdrop, in effect moves the landscape back inside. It makes it into a stage in a way that's very similar to the way that the landscape itself outside of the walls operated for the Garrett family, a space of welcome to people who were visiting, both then and now, a space for fundraising, a space for strolling, of collecting, of conversation. And we see this brought now inside in the Bakst theater, which included, of course, a number of very sort of avant-garde designs, roosters and foliate patterns along the walls as well, that are sort of reference the landscape, but now in a more modernist sense. So nature brought indoors, I think really blurring the boundaries between inside and outside, where the picturesque garden is a stage, both then and now for us in the 21st century. So thank you so much. And I will end there. I think we have time for Q&A.
April, thank you so much. I feel like I could have listened all day. Just so much interesting information that helps provide so much context for broadening our view of Evergreen and putting it in a national and in an international context for understanding its landscape. We have right now we have 12 questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to open those questions, and then you and I can field them as best as we can. Let's see why we cannot. All right. I'm going to go in, I think, the reverse order here, because I think that'll So we have some comments. I don't think our listeners can listen to all these comments. So I'm just going to read through them, and if there's a question, one of us will tackle it. So let's do that. One of the comments is, I have sung many times at Evergreen as a member of the Old Baltimore Music Club and as a student at Peabody. Thank you. That was from Elaine Davis, and we still do concerts at Evergreen, and we hope when we reopen, we can continue to do them. How many gardeners now at Evergreen? That is a really excellent question. I'm glad someone asked that. We had a on-site groundskeeper for many years, and he recently retired, and we now outsource all the gardening at Evergreen to a landscape company that also does landscaping for many, for Loyola and other universities and institutions in the area. How much land did Glen Mary first have, and how much land does Evergreen have now? My understanding is that Glen Mary was originally 15 acres, and under the Garretts, they expanded that estate quite a lot, and I believe now we are 26 acres. How did JHU receive Evergreen? I'm going to skip that one and get back to it next week. That's your hook to come back and listen next week to me. I'm going to try and stick to the gardens. Okay, April, I'm going to let you take this one. Someone was asking if we would consider Greenmont Cemetery an urban garden. And how can we think about, how do we think about cemeteries in general as urban outdoor spaces?
That is a very good question. And I'll start by saying that I would have to investigate that more carefully myself. So my response is more sort of my first impulse, and rather than an informed response based on research, because I haven't done a lot of research on cemeteries. But cemeteries are public spaces, public green spaces, and filled with sculpture. That is the monuments themselves. And I would, one of the aspects that strikes me very much about, say, cemeteries I visited in Europe, cemeteries in the States, is that they are both places of contemplation and places of memory, and in a sense, places of conversations, much just of a different kind. The landscape architecture is another aspect that varies widely among cemeteries. So in that, the way the landscape interacts with the monuments is also widely varies. So I'm not sure I'm really answering that question, but I like the idea that Greenmount Cemetery, which in urban, and I do think of cemeteries as gardens. That's my short answer is that yes, they're public spaces for memory and the exchange of stories. Ideally, gardens are.
April, can I throw one more question over to you, and then and then I'd like to make a few closing comments, but I'm also happy to stay on with you and continue to answer questions if people have them. But I know some people do need to leave on time, and I want to be respectful of the hour. So if we really quickly can just in the last 5 minutes tackle this one question, which I think is awesome. It's from a Hopkins colleague of mine, and it asks, why does it seem that most garden designs are oriented toward the back of the house? So definitely true for Evergreen, right? And we focused on the back today. There's more interest there than in the front, but I think also in our own lives, I have a bit of a 20th century answer, but I don't know how accurate it is. I'd love to know your early modern and sort of 19th century response.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm again, my expertise is early modern. Yeah. Thanks for noting. I have not done deep research in sort of 19th and 20th and 21st century landscaping. Although I am fascinated by the history of the American lawn, and the notion of the front porch versus the back porch, and where do you orient that. But when I think of villas in, say, the 16th century, I'm most familiar with villas of Palladio, for example. The lands really extend around the house, and the house is the center of things. And ideally the house is situated, the villa is situated in a high space, perhaps not the highest space, maybe not the foot of the hill, but somewhere midway up the hill, so that there's not so much a front and a back, but that rather the gardens become more refined the closer one gets to the house. I think that could be true here. And then the further out you get from the house, that liminal space between the manicured garden and the rustic countryside dissolves, usually in plantings of conifers are typically on the outskirts. So again, long way of answering is it in front or behind? It's really the house is kind of at the middle of things.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and in a sense, Evergreen's a little bit like that, I think, especially with its front and back. I haven't really thought about that with Evergreen, but it's the Charles Street, New York entrance. Yeah.
So I'm gonna extend a few thank yous now, because I see some people are leaving, but then I will stay on. And April, if you're able to stay on for a few more minutes, I'm happy to answer a few more questions. One came in that I would like to tackle, but before we do that, feel free to leave if you have to, but before you go, please accept my huge thanks for joining us today. This is the first time we've done this. We're looking forward to doing more. It's a new format for us. I'm a lifelong museum educator. I'm used to seeing the people I'm teaching and dragging them around with me. So it's hard for me to contain myself to my seat, but I'm going to get better at it. You can see me kind of bouncing around a little while I talk. And I hope you come back next week and the following week. We're really thrilled to have you join us. Please consider becoming members. And please stay engaged with us both at Evergreen and at Homewood Museum, which is JHU Museum's other museum. And we'll be having some programming through that museum as well in the future, and we hope that you can join us for that. Again, my name is Lori Finkelstein. I'm the director at Evergreen. And you can reach out to me at lfinkelstein@jhu.edu if you have any follow-up questions or just want to engage about the museum in general. I'm going to put my email address in the chat if anyone wants to reach out to me with feedback or comments or ideas for future talks that you might like to have. So I just put that in the chat and I would love to hear from you. So if you need to go, it was nice meeting you virtually today. Someone did ask, I'm going to stick on if anyone wants to stick on with me to answer this one question that came through, which was, are there other estates like Evergreen in North Baltimore still? Privately owned, what happened to the other ones, broken up for development? And I'm just selfishly answering that question from anonymous attendee because I've spent the past 4 months working from home, kind of obsessively researching this subject. And it might be good fodder or good, good subject matter for a future talk. So the short answer is almost all the land in this area was broken up into smaller suburban developments. The largest landowner in the area surrounding Evergreen here in the northern part of Baltimore City was the Perrine family. And I think they had, I want to say 146 acres, and they sold it all to the Roland Park Company, which developed their land into Homeland. So that neighborhood in Baltimore was one large estate. And of course, the Roland Park Company also developed the Roland Park neighborhood. And Olmsted firm, so that second generation of Olmsted, not Frederick Olmsted the first, but his sons were sort of the force behind that firm. And that firm also developed Guilford, which was itself a very large estate owned by the Abel family, who were the owners of the Baltimore Sun. So the short answer to your question is those independent estates in Baltimore City no longer exist. They've been subdivided into assorted suburbs. One exception would be where Carroll Mansion is. That was a Hopkins estate, and it is now a city park, and the original home is still there. But for the most part, they are now suburban developments. And I drive up and down Charles all the time looking for vestiges of the former estates. And you can see some near the Elkridge Golf Course. There's like two stone, I don't know what the right word is, pilasters? The two stone remnants of what must have been an entrance gate. And apparently somewhere in the depths of Homeland is the original, is one of the groundskeepers' homes that's still there. I've tried to find it and I can't. So, so if there's interest in that subject, I would love to talk more about it in the future and control myself now because I could go on for another half hour. I'm not gonna do that to all of you. I'm gonna give one more look to the chat to see if anything else comes up, and then I think we will we'll round it up. We'll finish it up rather. So one question is, did Alice Garrett travel extensively in Europe touring classical and Renaissance gardens and villas? Is there evidence of direct reference to specific sites in the design of Evergreen's gardens? So both Alices, the first Alice and the second Alice, both visited Europe. But we do not know if there's specific reference, if they made specific reference, or I don't have evidence of specific reference between what they might have seen there and their designs at Evergreen, but I've not searched all the archives. So maybe we will keep our eye open for that, and perhaps we will find that in the future. Another question is, did the second Alice make the rather substantial changes in the landscape solely as a matter of taste, or did financial considerations come into play? So the answer is both. The greenhouses were very expensive to heat and maintain. So after the first Alice died in 1920, they were torn down and there was a cost savings associated with it, but it was also a matter of taste. That, as April mentioned during her talk, there was a desire to make the landscape of the house flow with the redesigns that happened to the house in the 1920s, so they would function as part of a whole. I'm going to look for one more recent question, and then I think we'll wrap it up. Mm-hmm. So one last question is from our docent that one of our docents, and she was told that one of the retaining walls was actually the remnant of a greenhouse. We can down the road clarify some of that. There are still some walls that are remnants of greenhouses, but John Wirt Garrett and Alice Wirt Garrett also built a terrace on the side of the house that had umbrellas for entertaining purposes. So there was definitely some repurposing, but also some new construction. April, is there anything else you'd like to add? And I would like to just thank you one more time so much for your generous and thoughtful, wonderful presentation today. Please, if you would like to wrap it up, I'd be really grateful to give you the final word, please.
Oh my goodness. Thank you. This has been such a treat to think about these gardens, which I drive by several times a week. And Evergreen is a gem in Baltimore, the gardens, to imagine what they were like, but they're still very beautiful today. If anything, what I've realized is how much there is yet to uncover, or to unearth, I suppose, with these gardens. That there are many photographs that are just lying in wait of further research, and even to details of what garden books might be in the library. We know that the book on Charles Platt's book is in the library. I mean, it's not to say that necessarily they're pouring through them and reading them carefully, that they're owned. I mean, it gives us kind of a taste of a slice of ideas that were in the air at the time. So if anything, I think that it's been exciting to get a sense of how much there is yet left to do. And so, and how much more how many more ideas you might have to share about ways that future audiences could engage in the garden. So thank you. That would be what I would add to this is that now I know how much more there is to learn about the gardens. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jamie, Caroline, anything that you'd like to wrap up with or share before we go?
I just want to say thank you to everybody. You will receive a recording of this video. Again, please join and become a member of the museum. I'll give you information about how to do that. And we really appreciate everything. There'll be a follow-up email, so just look forward to that. And we hope to see you at the next 2 sessions. We're excited. Thank you so much to April and Lori. You guys were amazing.
All right.
Thank
you, everyone.
you.
We look forward to seeing you next week. April,
Yes.
thanks very much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Lori.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.